I begin with a personal story as well. I do this particularly for the younger people here, because a half century ago seems like a very long time to you, and it wasn't that far ago. So I want to tell you about myself a half century or more ago. One of 9 children, raised on a farm, chicken farming, which is the least glamorous form of farming, I promise you. Raised in the snow belt of upstate New York, a farm that teetered on the brink of failure, which is how we came to move to Florida 56 years ago when I was 14. It was a time and a place where the water fountains in the grocery stores were labeled colored and white, where the motto of my senior class at all-white Manatee High in Brayton was, "We're the best, we're from Dixon, we're the class of 1960." Where the black kids were bused across the river to Lincoln Memorial High, where in my senior year of high school, the sheriff of Manatee County escorted the Ku Klux Klan through the streets of Blackie Springs. I then went to college, to the University of Florida, and in my junior year, the undergraduate divisions were desegregated. Perhaps half the students thought this was right and just, and I promise you the other half was convinced that either Satan or communists had taken over, maybe both of them. The first newspaper I worked for, the St. Petersburg Times, was generally regarded as a progressive newspaper for the South at that time. But it's worth your knowing that it had a colored news page that only black subscribers received. And it took a very long time for newspaper reporting and editing staffs to begin to reflect the communities they served. And I'm proud that I participated in that change. The backdrop of all we're talking about today is change. America at that time had to change, in my estimation, were we to have any credibility whatsoever as any sort of beacon to the world. The change came slowly, painfully, ultimately insistently, ultimately inexorably. Journalism was charged with covering the story of change, but itself was terribly slow to change, way too slow. I'm a lifelong learner. Almost all my life I have read at least a book a week. The preponderance of my reading is history and biographies with a special focus on hatred and racism and anti-Semitism and any form of prejudice. And I would tell you to this day that racism remains the great cancer of American society. And we are a long, long, long way from being a post-racial society. And my own estimation is maybe none of us will ever see that, but we can come closer to it. You and I live in a nation with vast and unfulfilled promises of pluralism, a nation where discrimination is not yet infrequent, where millions of people still do not have an equal opportunity for their fair share of reward and responsibility. And each of us, I would argue, is to some extent a prisoner of our own bias. Most often the faith or color or gender or nationality we know the most about is obviously our own. We build our biases on what we have seen, what we have experienced, what we have been told, what we have read or learned. But too often, in my estimation, we've not learned enough to accumulate the wisdom to challenge our own prejudices. And that each of us must struggle all our lives with the human tendency to feel most comfortable with people like ourselves. We're in a particularly painful time today. The American people, it seems to me, are in a great eye-gouging, ear-deafening wrestling match for the American soul. And that is reflected most obviously in the current presidential campaign. In my lifetime, I've never seen more hatred and anger than now, aided and abetted, in my estimation, by short attention spans. And much of the media who have figured out you can make a hell of a lot of money by crapping on other people. And that's about it. An extraordinary amount of American anger, we are honest with ourselves, has to do with racism. Racism much more nuanced than it once was, but nonetheless palpably ugly and deeply destructive of the Republic and those who dream of a better America with the wisdom and the decency to embrace everyone's chances to succeed. I told you I read a lot of history. History teaches us that while people of goodwill are central to vision, that in fact goodwill is not the central driver of progress. Real progress requires pushing and shoving and urging and cajoling and coaxing, and then pushing some more courteously when you can, otherwise, if that doesn't work. For anyone here who thinks that the suffrage and the Social Security, Medicare and the civil rights and the feminist movements came to pass because good people came to their senses and decided to do the right thing by humankind, I would encourage you to read a lot more history. We also need to remember that what seemed radical at one time in our history in this ever-evolving country ultimately became, over time and after struggle, what so many of us see as basic and decent and fundamental to an America that lives its justice. With the exception of science and medicine, progress can never come, in my estimation, without struggle. It needs to be personal as well as group struggle. As each of us musters the inner wisdom and fortitude to confront ourselves, the very deepest learning comes to pass. I'm going to share with you, when I come back, my own sense of a quite specific, quite pragmatic approach to real change, real fairness, real opportunity.